Highways were built to connect us, to carry families on road trips, to move freight across nations, to take dreamers somewhere new. But sometimes, highways don't just take people to places. Sometimes, they take people. Tonight, we're traveling 3 roads. One carved through the deserts of Route 66, one cutting across the heart of America on Interstate 70, and one stretching through the cold wilderness of Highway 16, known by another name, the Highway of Tears. These are not urban legends. These are not campfire stories. These are real people, real investigations, real failures. Tonight we're talking about hitchhikers who vanished, stores where killers walked in and out unnoticed, and a pig farm that became one of the darkest crime scenes in Canadian history. Turn off the lights, lock your doors, and listen carefully, because sometimes the most dangerous place in the world is the open road. There is a stretch of old Route 66 in the American Southwest that locals have quietly called the Hitcher's Mile for decades. You won't find it on any map or sign. It's just a name shared by people who grew up near those roads, who remember the stories their parents told them in quiet voices. Don't hitchhike on that road. Don't stop for strangers on that road. Something happened there, more than once. The official story of Route 66 is full of neon lights and nostalgia, the open road, the American dream, burger stands, motor lodges, and long sunset drives in a hopeful country. But beneath that postcard image, there is another story. It's darker and quieter, found not in guidebooks but in missing persons reports and cold case files in sheriff offices across New Mexico, Arizona, and Oklahoma, some dating back to the 1950s. This is the story of one of those files, and of a killer, or killers, who may never have been caught. In the summer of 1973, a 22-year-old woman named Carol Ann Dodds left Tulsa, Oklahoma, with a backpack, a sleeping bag, and $40. She was heading to California. She had a friend in Santa Monica who had promised her a couch and a job interview at a restaurant. Carol Ann had graduated from a community college the previous spring, had been working at a hardware store, and had decided, the way young people do, that this was not enough. She wanted the ocean. She wanted something new. She told her mother she would call from Amarillo, Texas. She never called. The Tulsa police took a missing persons report 3 weeks later, when Carol Ann's mother, after calling Santa Monica and learning her daughter had never arrived, finally drove to the police station herself. The officer who took the report noted that the woman was an adult, that she had left voluntarily, and that there was no evidence of foul play. He suggested she may have changed her plans. Carol Ann's mother, a woman named Ruth Dodds, said, "My daughter always calls. Always. Something is wrong." The investigation, such as it was, went nowhere. But Ruth Dodds did not stop. For the next 11 years, she made phone calls, wrote letters, drove to sheriff offices in 5 different states, and became, without any training or resources, the closest thing her daughter had to a detective. She contacted other families, and she found them, one by one, families whose sons and daughters had vanished along the same corridor of highway during the same general period. Young people, most of them hitchhiking, most of them last seen at truck stops or on ramps, or at the edge of small towns along Route 66. She identified at least 9 cases between 1971 and 1978 that shared similar characteristics. Young adults, traveling alone, hitchhiking westward, vanished without a trace in a corridor stretching from Oklahoma City through Amarillo, Albuquerque, and into northern Arizona. No bodies, in most cases. No witnesses. No pattern that any single law enforcement jurisdiction recognized, because each case belonged to a different county in a different state, and in those years before national databases and coordinated investigations, the cases simply didn't talk to each other. Ruth Dodds wrote a letter to the FBI in 1979. She laid out what she had found. She asked if anyone was looking at the possibility of a serial offender working the Route 66 corridor. She received a form letter in return. In 1981, a partial human skeleton was found by a road crew near a dry creek bed approximately 14 miles east of Gallup, New Mexico. The remains were those of a young woman, estimated age 20 to 30, with no identifying documents. She was buried as Jane Doe. The case was filed with the McKinley County Sheriff's Office and largely forgotten. In 1994, a forensic genealogist working on a cold case review matched Jane Doe's dental records through a comparison with records submitted by Ruth Dodds years earlier to Carol Ann Dodds of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Carol Ann had made it as far as eastern New Mexico. Someone had killed her there, in the desert, 14 miles from Gallup at some point in the summer of 1973. Ruth Dodds was 71 years old when she got the call. She had spent 21 years looking. She said, according to the investigator who called her, only 2 words when she was told they had found her daughter. She said, "I know." The investigation into Carol Ann's death was reopened in the mid-1990s as part of a broader federal examination of long-haul homicide patterns along major interstate corridors. Investigators began to look seriously at what Ruth Dodds had been saying for 2 decades, that the Route 66 corridor had been, for a period of years, a hunting ground. A profile emerged, pieced together from what little evidence existed. The victims were overwhelmingly young, traveling alone, with no fixed itinerary, meaning no one expected them at any particular place at any particular time. The killer, or killers, appeared to operate from a vehicle comfortable on long stretches of highway, possibly a truck or large van. The geographic spread of the cases suggested mobility, someone who moved, who had a reason to be on that road regularly. The truck stop theory gained traction. Long-haul truckers drove those routes constantly. The culture of hitchhiking in the 1970s meant that accepting a ride from a trucker was not only common but also considered one of the safer options. Truckers were visible, identifiable, and professional with established schedules. Or so the hitchhikers thought. Investigators eventually identified a person of interest, a former long-haul driver who had operated a refrigerated freight route between Tulsa and Los Angeles throughout the 1970s, whose route traced almost exactly the corridor Ruth Dodds had mapped. He had been convicted in 1983 of the assault and attempted murder of a woman in Barstow, California, a hitchhiker he had picked up and left for dead in the desert. He had served 11 years and was released in 1994. He was never charged in connection with the Route 66 disappearances. The evidence was not sufficient. He died in 2003. Carol Ann Dodds is buried in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Her mother, Ruth, died in 2001, 3 years before the cold case file on her daughter's killer was officially closed without charges. The other 8 cases Ruth Dodds identified remain officially unsolved. The Hitcher's Mile is still there, still 2 lanes, still cutting through the same dry, beautiful, merciless desert. No sign marks it, just the road, and the wind, and the long silence of what the earth knows and keeps. Interstate 70 runs 2,151 miles across the belly of America, from Cove Fort, Utah in the west to Baltimore, Maryland on the eastern seaboard. It passes through Denver, Kansas City, St. Louis, Indianapolis, and Columbus. It is, by almost any measure, the most traveled inland highway in the United States. Millions of people drive it every year. Millions of trucks haul freight across it. And for a period in the late 1980s and early 1990s, something moved along it. Something patient, deliberate, and very difficult to see. They called him the I-70 killer. Law enforcement never officially confirmed a single suspect. The case files remain open. But the evidence, pieced together from 7 murders across 6 states, tells a story so specific, so consistent, that investigators have long believed it was the work of one man. The first confirmed killing was in April 1992 in Wichita, Kansas. A woman working alone in a retail store, a craft supply shop near an I-70 interchange, was shot once in the head at close range, execution style. The store had been open. Nothing was taken. There were no witnesses. The victim was in her 20s, with brown hair and a slight build. The shooting appeared to be targeted, but she had no known enemies, no troubled history, nothing that explained why someone would want her dead. 6 days later in Terre Haute, Indiana, also directly on the I-70 corridor, a woman working alone in a shoe store near an interstate ramp was killed in almost identical circumstances. One shot, close range, during business hours. Nothing taken, no witnesses. The victim, a young woman, brown hair, slight build. Police in Wichita and Terre Haute were not initially connected. Different states, different jurisdictions. The cases were filed separately. The pattern was invisible because no one was looking at the whole map yet. But over the next 3 months, 5 more killings occurred. Indiana, Missouri, Texas, Kentucky. Each one is frighteningly similar. Retail stores. Female employees working alone or with minimal staff. Young women with brown hair and slight builds. One shot, close range. Nothing taken. No forensic evidence of any substance. The killer appeared to wear gloves, moved quickly, and left nothing behind. By the summer of 1992, the FBI had identified the pattern and opened a coordinated investigation. A geographic profile placed the killer's movement along the I-70 corridor with statistical precision. The victim's physical similarities, brown hair, similar height and build, suggested the killer was selecting for a specific type. The retail store locations, all near interstate ramps, suggested the killer could move quickly from the location and disappear back onto the highway within minutes. The profile that emerged was specific. White male, late 20s to mid-40s, physically unremarkable. Possibly a tradesman or sales professional with a reason to travel the I-70 corridor regularly. Someone who would not stand out in a retail store. Someone who could walk in, appear to browse, identify whether the victim was alone, make a decision, and be gone within 4 minutes. The hitchhiking connection entered the investigation through one of the surviving witnesses, a woman who worked in the back office of the Indiana shoe store on the day of the killing, who had stepped away moments before the shooting. She described seeing a man enter the store and speak briefly to her colleague. She described him as ordinary, forgettable, average height, average build, dark jacket. She said he had a way of looking at the room, slowly, methodically, that she noticed but didn't understand until afterward. Investigators found, through analysis of credit card records near the crime scenes on the relevant dates, a pattern of fuel purchases at highway truck stops. They found, through interviews with hitchhikers who had passed through those areas and come forward after media coverage, 2 separate accounts of a man who had picked up hitchhikers on I-70 during that period. A man who had been, by the hitchhikers' accounts, quiet, calm, interested in where they were going, how long they would be there, whether they were meeting anyone. One of those hitchhikers, a 20-year-old man from Columbus who gave a statement to the FBI in 1993, said the man had asked him at one point, "If you got out of here, right now, who would know where you were?" He had laughed at the question. He had thought it was small talk. He had asked to be let out at the next exit. The FBI developed a suspect in 1995, a man from the Midwest with a sales territory that covered exactly the I-70 corridor, a vehicle matching witness descriptions, and a history of violence against women that had been reported but never fully prosecuted in a domestic context. His name was never publicly released. The investigation stalled when key evidence was ruled inadmissible due to procedural errors in how the search warrant had been obtained. The I-70 killings stopped after 1992. No further murders matching the profile were identified. Either the killer stopped, died, was incarcerated for another crime, or became more careful. The 7 victims range in age from 19 to 36. They all had names, families, futures. They all worked ordinary jobs near ordinary highway ramps in ordinary American cities. They were killed, Most investigators believe because they matched a type, because they were alone, because the highway made escape effortless. The FBI's cold case unit reviews the file periodically. DNA technology has advanced significantly since 1992. There is always the possibility that something held in evidence, something that seemed like nothing at the time, will one day speak. Somewhere, possibly a man grew old with this. Possibly he is already dead. Possibly he is alive, living quietly, with neighbors who would describe him as pleasant, unremarkable, the kind of person you would never suspect. That is, of course, the point. This story begins with a highway, as so many dark stories do. But it ends in a pig farm. And what was found there rewrote the history of one of the most catastrophic failures of law enforcement in Canadian history. The Highway of Tears is a 724-kilometer stretch of Highway 16 in northern British Columbia, running between Prince George and Prince Rupert through some of the most remote and beautiful terrain on Earth. Boreal forest, mountain passes, rivers that run cold even in August. Indigenous communities are scattered along its length, connected to larger towns by this single road. For decades, the highway was the only practical way to travel between them. And for young women without cars, hitchhiking was not an adventure. It was a necessity. Between 1969 and 2006, at least 18 women and girls, and by some estimates, more than 40, vanished or were found murdered along Highway 16. The majority were Indigenous women. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police were slow to investigate, slow to connect the cases, and repeatedly criticized by the families of victims and by Indigenous community leaders for treating the disappearances as lower priority than they would have been had the victims been white. Tanya Holick was 20 years old when she disappeared in 1996. She was from a small community near Prince George. She was last seen hitchhiking on Highway 16. Her disappearance was reported to the RCMP. The investigation was minimal. She was, like so many of the women who vanished along that road, allowed to become a statistic. She was not a statistic. She was a person. And what happened to her, what happened to many of the women of the Highway of Tears, would eventually be connected to a man named Robert William Picton. Picton was a pig farmer. He operated a farm in Port Coquitlam, a suburb east of Vancouver, about 800 kilometers south of the Highway of Tears. He was unremarkable in the way that certain monsters are unremarkable, slovenly, provincial, given to bragging and crude humor, the kind of man people described as harmless because they couldn't imagine otherwise. He was not harmless. Beginning in the early 1990s and continuing until his arrest in 2002, Picton lured vulnerable women, many of them sex workers from Vancouver's downtown east side, many of them Indigenous, many of them struggling with addiction, to his farm. He killed them there. He disposed of their remains on the property in ways so thorough and so horrifying that investigators, when they finally searched the farm, spent years in the process and still could not recover everything. Tanya Holick's DNA was found on the Picton property. So was the DNA of many others. Robert Picton was convicted in 2007 of 6 counts of second-degree murder. He was originally charged in connection with 26 deaths. He confessed in a jailhouse conversation, recorded without his knowledge, to killing 49 women. He said in that recording that he had wanted to make it 50 but had been caught first. The Highway of Tears connection to Picton was and remains a matter of ongoing investigation and dispute. His farm was far from the highway. Some of the Highway of Tears disappearances predate Picton's known killing period. Some investigators and advocates believe there was more than one predator working the highway, that its remoteness, its vulnerable population, and the recimp's decades of inadequate response created conditions that multiple killers may have exploited over multiple decades. What is not disputed is this: young women were hitchhiking that highway because they had no other option. And they were disappearing, and for years, the institutions that should have protected them treated their lives as less important than the paperwork involved in investigating them. The failure of the Highway of Tears is not just a story about a killer. It is a story about who gets protected and who doesn't, about which missing people make the news and which ones don't, about how a highway can become a killing ground, not just because a predator chooses it, but because the people in power look away long enough for it to become routine. The Native Women's Association of Canada, in a 2010 report, documented 582 cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls across Canada. A national inquiry launched in 2016 concluded that what had happened constituted genocide, a word that is precise, legal, and devastating. Tanya Holick had a family. She had a name. She had 20 years of life and the rest of it still ahead of her when she put out her thumb on a cold northern highway and stepped into something she couldn't have known was coming. Her story, and the stories of the women beside her on that long list, are not cautionary tales about the dangers of hitchhiking. They are testimonies about what happens when certain lives are treated as expendable, about the particular cruelty of a world that offers no safe way to travel and then blames the traveler for what happens on the road. In 2021, the Canadian government announced funding for improved transportation and safety infrastructure along Highway 16, including a bus service that advocates had been requesting for decades. The bus service was called a step in the right direction. It was also, by most estimates, about 40 years late. The Highway of Tears is still there. The forest is still dark. The mountains are still beautiful in the way that indifferent things are beautiful. And along the roadside, at intervals, there are now small signs, purple and white, with names on them. Not warnings, memorials, because the women who walked that highway were not problems to be solved. They were people, and they deserve better than they got from every institution that failed them, from every authority that looked away, from a country that let a highway become a mass grave and called it, for far too long, simply a mystery. Highways don't remember the cars that pass over them. The desert keeps its silence. The asphalt cools after sunset. Traffic moves on. But the families don't. Along Route 66, a mother searched for decades. Along Interstate 77, lives ended in minutes. Along Highway 16, entire communities waited for answers that came too late. Some killers were caught. Some were never named. Some may have lived quiet, ordinary lives, blending into the very society that feared them. The road is still there, still stretching, still silent, still waiting. If these stories moved you, share them, because memory is sometimes the only justice left. And somewhere tonight, someone is still driving west.